So today I'm going to be talking about the space race, actually. So I mean a bit of background. After the Second World War, well, this new conflict arose between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it was putting the world's two greatest powers, a democratic, capitalist United States versus a very strong authoritarian communist Soviet Union against each other. So one of the things they did in this Cold War was the space race. Race to see who was the first who could achieve many things in space, like the first man to orbit, the first man to land on the moon, and it was this competition between them. So, well, by the mid 1950s, well, the Cold War was just everywhere in these countries. You couldn't live in the U.S. without knowing about the tensions against the USSR, and you can live in the USSR without knowing about the tensions between your country and the U.S. So there was this threat of nuclear weapons growing, espionage, counter-espionage, the Korea War, ideological clashes, the Berlin Wall of 1961, and most notably, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, Vietnam War. Tensions were extremely high, not only in the U.S. and USSR, as you can see, also in other countries. Well, this new area just opened up for conflict, which is the space exploration. Because on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, which is Russian for traveler. This was the first artificial satellite, which was a huge milestone, the first man-made object to actually go into space. Now the U.S. naturally came as a surprise, and they thought, hey, we can one up that. We are going to make that, but even better. So we're going to win at that. Well, they of course didn't want to lose territory in space, because you have land. Of course, the U.S. wanted to expand to space, so they couldn't take too long in developing things, because otherwise the USSR would dominate space, and that was a huge no-no. Because imagine if the entire Earth was surrounded by USSR powered satellites, that would be a huge problem for the US. So of course, that meant that the US had to get to work. Also, this power of the R-7 missile, which could be used to not only send stuff into space, but also nuclear weapons into US territory, made things quite urgent, because of course the US would not want anything going into their territory, because it's Cold War, the nuclear threat was still there. So yeah, in 1958, the US said, okay, last year you launched Sputnik, we're going to do that, like I mentioned before, and they launched their own satellite designed by the US Army called Explorer 1. This was made under the direction of the rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, and that same year, US President at the time, who was Dwight D. Eisenhower, he signed a public order creating a National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which was entirely dedicated to space exploration. This organization is NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Eisenhower also created two national space security orientated programs, and which would operate with NASA, but this was more of security. NASA was more exploration. And at this point, exploration was crucial, because the more they explored, the more territory in space they could claim for the US, and then they could develop weapons and assert supremacy. But right now, what they had to be focused on was exploration. These security ones also existed. The first one was headed by the US Air Force, which was to try and see how space could be used with a military perspective. So how could it be weaponized, essentially? The second one was actually led by the Central Intelligence Agency, so the CIA, and the Air Force, and this new organization called the National Reconnaissance Office, which was actually kept under wraps until the 1990s because no one could really. This National Reconnaissance suggests kind of spying, spy rings, secret operations that could not go into light. So the second one was more secret, and the code name was Corona. Obviously, no relations to the coronavirus, but the name was Corona, which I don't really know if it's what they mean, but in Spanish, Corona means crown. So, well, it would use orbiting satellites to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union and its allies, which makes sense if you think of the organizations involved: CIA, Air Force, and this National Reconnaissance Office. That would be used entirely for espionage. So it makes sense that a second security organization was set up just for space espionage. So now in 1959, things kind of heat up. The Soviet Union says, "Oh, you sent an explorer. Oh, we're gonna send the satellite Luna 2, which was the first space probe to actually hit the moon." So now the Soviets were actually made contact with the moon. For the US, this was terrible because by this point, the USSR was winning the space race. They had the first man-made object launched into space and the first object to hit the moon. So if they wanted to win the space race, they needed to do something about it. Well, in April 61, things did not get better for the US because Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth on a capsule-like spacecraft called the Vostok 1. Well, it was 1961, the US hadn't made any major leaps and they were falling further behind. Now, of course, with Gagarin, the Soviets were miles ahead, quite literally, because he was the first man in space. So the US really had to get going because it was Cold War. If they lost in the space race, that would probably give the Soviets confidence to do more things in Earth, maybe nuclear war. They asserted their dominance in space, then had control over the space over the US. Well, that could prove a huge problem, and they could probably lose this Cold War. So the US needed to get things heated. So there was this effort to send a man into space called Project Mercury, and NASA designed a smaller cone-shaped capsule, which was generally lighter than the Vostok. And instead of sending someone in space, they sent a chimp. This was in March 61. So, like I said, they did make some progress during these years, but it was Yuri Gagarin who was the first man in space. Yes, the US sent the first monkey, but that is not really anything. That just shows that they sent a living thing. That means nothing unless they can send a human there. They held like test flights and stuff all throughout March, up until March, and the Soviets eventually did send the first man into space prior to the US. But on May 5th, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space. Now this it is progress for the US, but it's not huge progress because A, yes, he's the first American, but not the first man in space. And B, he only went into space, didn't even go around, didn't even orbit it. So, yes, it was a leap, but it wasn't what the US needed if they wanted to win the space race. And, from 1961 to 1964, NASA and the US knew and recognized how significant the space race was. It wasn't just another conflict, it was really important. So they increased the budget to almost 500%. So, the lunar landing program, which was, the program aimed at sending someone to the moon and landing there, involved 34,000 NASA employees and 375,000 employees of industry and other industries and university contractors. So you can just see the manpower in this. There's over 400,000 people involved in this lunar landing program. This program, I do believe, was named Apollo, the famous Apollo program. Well, there was a setback in January 1967, in which they thought they had really gotten something done, but they tried to send three astronauts into space. So prior to this, they needed to simulate conditions, and in a simulation, there was a fire, and 3 astronauts were killed. So that was a setback, but they took things back. This tragedy really struck the U.S. because they had to stop the program for a bit, which meant that gave more time for the Soviets to push forward, and that's the thing the U.S. didn't really want. But the Soviet Union also had this lunar landing program. They also wanted to send the first man to the moon, and they were still making progress, but not as much as NASA. Of course, the U.S. did not know this. There was a lot of debate over this. Should we do this? Should we send a man to the moon? And that really stalled things. Also, the death in January 1966 of Sergei Korolev, how you pronounce that, who was the chief engineer of the Soviet space program. Well, that really slowed things down. So there were tragedies on both sides. But by this point, 1967, the Soviets were currently ahead. They had the first man orbiting space. They had the first man-made object in space. So the U.S. really, really needed to push forward. And I know I've said this 100 times, but it's true. During the first years of the space race, the U.S. was losing quite a lot. Well, in December 1968, the launch of Apollo 8 happened, and this was the first big win for the U.S. because it was the first man-made object to orbit the moon. This launched from this NASA launch facility in Florida, and this is a huge win, and it gave people in the U.S. a lot of confidence. So, just a few months later, on July 16, 1969, U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on the Apollo 11 mission. That means that between December and July, there were Apollo mission 9 and 10, apart from 11. They landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969, and they were the first people to ever walk on the moon. This was a huge thing for the U.S., and it marked one of the most significant wins in the Cold War. It's not a military win, by no means. It's just this, hey, we stepped on the moon before you did. And the famous line, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Everyone knows that. So the man landing on the moon marked a huge win for the U.S., but who really won the space race? By landing on the moon, the U.S. kind of won, but it was all started with Sputnik and that launching of a satellite, and ended with the landing on the moon. The win, what is the win in the space race? Because I think would be complete dominance over the space surrounding Earth, but no one that's international area now. And even then, it wasn't even that dominated. The Soviets did try to launch lunar landing programs from 69 to 72, sorry. They did 4 programs, including this huge one in July 69. So around the time the US did theirs. But there was this spectacular explosion, but that, I mean, like I said, it was the US who landed first. In America, this space race was huge. The public loved this. It wasn't scary for them. I mean, the possibilities behind it were because possible militarization of space, but the idea behind this space race of sending men into space and exploring the world out there, that really captivated them. So American public was amazed by this. They were they kept track of how the Soviets were doing, how the Americans were doing, and well, of course, more and more people flooded to this program because of the publicity they were getting, maybe for their own selfish reasons, but the fact that more and more people rushed to work on this program, engineers, the part of the media, that gave a lot of confidence in the US and possible motivation. If the public were like, yeah, we don't really care about this is all great, yeah, I don't really care, probably they would have been as motivated to take over space as they were. Well, the astronauts gained this idea of American heroes because they had won over the USSR. They had won this race. I mean, like I said, it's debated as to what a space race is and how could you win this. But in the American propaganda, obviously, they said, we won the space race. And it glorified astronauts, therefore making more people run to be astronauts. And even today, an astronaut, I mean, it's one of the most dangerous jobs, but it's really popular. Well, the Soviets, like I said, American propaganda made sure that the US were the winners, and the Soviets were the villains who just had relentless efforts to suppress Americans and pass on their communist ideology and make it spread. So, well, the space race eventually ended. Nowadays, there is international collaboration. I think at one point, the Soviet Union collapsed, obviously. Russian astronauts were in the space station, the ISS, at the same time as American astronauts. There's no competition. I mean, everyone wants to have the first something, but I don't think there's such a thing as a space race today. And yeah, well, after the early 70s, people generally got bored of the lunar missions because, yeah, we had already landed in the moon, so what? In 1975, the Apollo Soyuz mission sent 3 astronauts into space. So they got into orbit in a Soviet-made Soyuz vehicle. So by this point, they were kind of collaborating, and like I said, this evolved from small collaborations like this Soyuz capsule into today's space collaboration program, because there's a lot of countries collaborating that would have never done this 50 years ago, would have never. And well, these commanders, like I said, when they met, they had a handshake in space, which meant that by this point, the US and the USSR were kind of stabilizing their relations, and everything was calming down. The Cold War wasn't over because that ended in 91 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the space race officially ended in 75 with this Apollo Soyuz mission. But it kind of went on, but not as this race. It was more proper development in the country itself rather than, let's beat the Russians. So that is the space race, one of the most interesting pieces of 20th century history, I think. It's very sciencey, also history, links to the Cold War. It's one of my favorite topics. So yeah, thank you for watching, and yeah, thank you so much. Bye.